Welcome back. We're into week 2 of the Relentless Courage of a Scared Child, part of the 6-week series. We're doing not only talking about the book, but talking about the lessons and how you can overcome anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief. And there's more in this book that any child should have to endure. And I am often amazed that you, when I first met you, downplayed the level of chaos.
Do you know, I actually learned, one thing I learned is that's the sign of resilience. The sign of resilience, it's one of the, not one of the signs, it's a trait of resilient people is that they minimize their trauma, and that's how they survive.
And you did, and you thrived, and I adored you. I want to read testimonial from Carrie Flynn. I just want to thank Dr. Amen for helping me. You're welcome. I listened to him on YouTube and started cutting out dairy, gluten, and corn. My happiness factor has much improved. I'm going to start reintroducing one food at a time to determine the culprit. At least I know the cause of my B- mood level was related to food sensitivity. If I want to cheat now, and then I'll know what to expect. You are a very good doctor, and you have helped me a lot. Thank you very much.
That's awesome.
I'm so happy.
Yeah.
So I'm working on a new book for Year After Next called Happy, the Neuroscience of Feeling Good. And that testimonial just made me happy.
Yep. That's awesome.
So food actually was very important for you because I think it's part of what kept you sick.
No question. I know it did now because like I said, I went on that journey to heal myself, and I was both I was all of the above: disturbed, angry, thrilled to finally have, an answer, and just confused. Why still, when you go to certain doctors in Western medicine, they're like, food doesn't matter, nutrition. I'm a nurse. And I mean, where I went to school, it did matter more, but I'm just mind blown at how that's still the conversation that happens. So, it matters.
So if you want to overcome anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief, get your food right. Tana's got a great cookbook, Brain Warriors Way cookbook. And, it just reminds me of, what I know about you when you were young. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Often left alone, often with processed food. And it's one of the ways you soothe the anxiety that you felt.
So I love what we teach about healing people in 4 circles: the biological, what's going on physically; the psychological, what's happening in your mind, how you think; the social; and the spiritual. And I never really thought of myself as a depressed kid until I started to, you asked me, you told me when we were dating, tell me some good childhood memories. And I couldn't come up with one. And now, funny, now that I've healed and now that I've done so much, work on this. And even as I was writing my book, I love the idea of writing your story because so much comes to light. Now I actually have a lot of good memories, but I couldn't think of one. And as I was telling you about my childhood, you're like, well, you were depressed. And I was like, how's a kid depressed? No, I wasn't. And I was depressed. So, and I was terrified. But all of those circles were suffering. The biology was clearly suffering. Physically, I was not healthy. Psychology, my family was not evolved. They weren't psychologically savvy.
They believed every stupid thing they thought.
And just the drama and the chaos just on a daily basis. There was the social, which I was totally alone. I was a latchkey kid and scared that my mom wasn't coming home. And then there was the spiritual, which really didn't exist in my life at that time. So
that the purpose of your life, your family's life, was survival. It really wasn't anything beyond that. And how old were you when your grandmother came to live with you?
She came to live with us permanently. She would be in and out. She came from Lebanon, and she didn't speak English very well, and she was always sick. She had diabetes. So she would come and go when I was really young. But then she came to live with us permanently when I was 11 because she had gone legally blind. Her diabetes was out of control. She was morbidly obese. She'd become a hoarder. And she became a hoarder because she never dealt with her trauma. So besides her son being murdered, when she never got over that. But when she was a young child, and back then it was Greater Syria, she was she went through World War I. It was just before World War I. It was the Great Famine. So she went through that, and she remembers having to run, when the Turks would come riding through, and she took off and she ran into the mountains, and she got separated from her family, and she was lost for 3 days up in the mountains. And so her hair was frozen and matted to her head when they found her. She was hypothermic. She was terrified of all the animals. And so that she never really recovered. And as a result of all of the things she had dealt with, she became this hoarder. She was morbidly obese. She would cry every time she turned the news on. And now looking back, I understand it's PTSD, but I didn't know that back then. She was just kind of scary. I loved her, but she was kind of scary. And she wouldn't come out of her room really. And so she came to live with us when I was 11, so I could give her insulin shots, so I could watch her.
Well, and a very important point with your grandmother's story is this thing called epigenetics, that what happens to us turns on or off certain genes that make illness more or less likely in our children and our grandchildren. So trauma, especially trauma that's not processed and dealt with, gets written in your genetic code.
And you're convinced.
And then passed down to other people. So when the pandemic happened, Tana has actually been getting ready for a famine for 3 generations.
Not just a famine. I'm getting ready for any type of disaster. I mean, I'm
from
obsessed.
the Turks coming into Newport Coast.
So I am obsessed with disaster planning, with survival training. Like I do all this stuff. And he's like, do I not take good care of you? So when the pandemic hit, I went, I told you so. Like you can either say thank you or I can say I told you so. So I've been obsessed with like disaster planning for decades.
And it may have nothing to do with her, but with
but if you saw my setup, you would be, those of you who like to plan for disasters, if you saw my setup, you would have disaster planning envy. That's all I'm going to say.
And all right. So as a child, almost drowned, often left alone, uncles murdered, in a drug deal gone wrong, upper and lower GIs.
I was sick all the time. Surgery and
latchkey kid. When you're 9, and I think this is really important.
Before I was 9, I mean, our house was broken into. So I've often talked about how the pandemic didn't bother me as much as the social unrest because it triggered me when our house was broken into frequently when I was young. I mean, it's weird how often it was broken into. We think it was because of my uncle's friends. They would come to steal stuff for drugs and whatever. And, a couple times they got caught, but it happened so often that it was a little odd. And either someone knew that it was just my mom and I, or it was someone who just knew they could come in because they always knew when to come in. But my mom shot a gun off in the house. And when I was really young, and then when I was 9, she took off running down the hall, chasing an intruder with a shotgun. And I remember the sound of the shotgun racking. And I'm like, she's going to shoot him in the back. Like I was convinced. My mom she's a little like this cross between Lucille Ball and the Tasmanian Devil. She's larger than life. She's a survivor. She's amazing, a little crazy, but it wasn't perfect.
So actually, before we get to 9 and the separation anxiety, I want to do that in the next podcast. What I want to encourage you to do is begin to write the story of your life. And I want you to write. So get a piece of paper.
I have a journal. I created a digital journal for you to be able to do this because it's so important and it was so impactful for me. It's one of the pre-order gifts that I helped with. I really wanted people to dig into this. And of course, the book is an example of sort of how you can do that. So you can write it in a balanced way. And there are other tools that are part of the pre-order gift to help you do this so that you can start to look at the people in your life who have been challenging for you through those 4 circles and begin to understand them better and then write this down.
And if you write it like every year, do you know? I mean, often that years early, you won't know. But what good happened and what stressful happened, you begin to get a timeline. And it's just so helpful to understand some of your automatic stressful reactions, which may have nothing to do with the present, but you don't want your life to be driven by the pain of your past. And there's a therapy I like called timeline therapy.
I love timeline therapy.
And, when I think of the timeline of my life, I see it from back to front.
So I see it in front of me.
My past is generally behind me and, less infecting me, but yours, because you see it.
You always say, why are you living in the past? I'm like, I'm not living in the past. What are you talking about? Because it's in front of me. I see it from left to right.
You see it from left to right, which means it's always there. And in March of
I can access it anytime.
And in March of next year, I have a new book called Your Brain is Always Listening, and talking about the dragons from the past. We've been talking about some of the dragons, right? The ancestral dragons, your grandmother's trauma.
I love that book. Because your book goes so well with my book. And it was such a weird thing. We didn't plan that.
No, and our new public television special, which is coming out at the end of February, we actually blend both of our books together. But we're going to do a whole 6-week series on my book coming up in January.
So you can get those tools at relentlesscourage.com, and it will help you begin to write the story of your life so you can look at it from an adult's perspective. Because sometimes we carry strategies from when we were a kid and we've never learned new strategies. And those strategies worked when you were 4 to help you survive.
In a traumatic situation.
But they don't work when you're 40, right? So it's going to help you begin to see that.
Great. All right. Stay with us. You can pre-order the book and get free gifts at relentlesscourage.com. Our event, December 12th, free on overcoming anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief. TanaAmen.com/event. Sign up. We already have hundreds of people signed up, and we would just love you and your friends there.
And we are giving away a scan.
And we're giving away a scan.
An evaluation.
An evaluation. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Amen. In the end of mental illness, I talk about, well, what if we reimagine mental health as brain health? And this one idea changes everything. Welcome back. We are so excited you're with us. We're going through some of the stories and relentless courage of a scared child. And but we're not just telling you about Tana's life. We're trying to help you deal with your anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief. And we're doing it through some of the stories that Tana writes about in the book. I want to talk about when you were 9, because the separation anxiety issue really dominated that year for you. And it happens for so many people. Let me read another testimonial. Robert says, I can't wait to try this for me and for my wife who has Alzheimer's. This could be very helpful for us. What a great idea. Thank you. And it was regarding an episode on how to heal yourself from trauma that we did with Dr. James Gordon. So
love that.
We're so happy that this is helpful for you.
So one thing before we get into all of that stuff, because you touched on something, writing a memoir when everyone is still alive, especially, is not an easy thing to do. So this book, even though it really is the stories from my life, it's the family friendly version. It's actually under, I had the editor call me and go, are you sure this isn't over exaggerated? And I started laughing, and you started laughing because you've treated a number of people in my family, and you're like, no, it's actually under exaggerated because they're alive. So there's only so much you can say when people are living, right? But there's no reason to write a memoir for me. I didn't need people being voyeuristic into my life. I didn't do it for years, even though you were nudging me, because I didn't want that. But then when between what happened at the Salvation Army, and I had a woman come up to me and go, I pray every day that God will do for my life what he did in your life. If you can do it, I can do it. And I'm like, I haven't even really told her much about my life. So I haven't revealed it yet. And it was those things that made me realize, okay, I'm going to write a memoir, but I'm not going to write it from a victim perspective. If I'm going to write a memoir, the only reason to do it is to help someone. So that's my hope. My hope is that it will help someone.
And, what I discovered when I was a young psychiatrist is the more real I was, the more helpful I was. And too often people think of psychiatrists as sort of blank slates.
Right.
And, they're just feeding back to you. And it's just never me. And I found when I would share the vulnerabilities I had growing up, with my children, with our marriage, that people just saw me as more real, and I was a more effective change agent. So now, don't just share all of your life story unless you process it.
Right.
Right. And I think
because there is a vulnerability.
Because otherwise it could be shared with anger and bitterness and it could end up being really messy and not helpful.
And it can hurt your relationships.
And I want to, because we're sort of going through some of these really important stories, and your dad was just sort of not much of a big factor when you were young.
No, he left my parents split up when I was 2 months old. He did drugs for a while with my uncle and was partying. He became a Baptist minister. All of a sudden he showed up one day with a new wife who I ended up really liking. But he just showed up out of the blue and was a Baptist minister and now wants to see me when it's convenient for him, in the summer for a couple of weeks or whatever. And once in a while on a holiday, but I didn't know him. And he starts talking to me about Jesus. And I'm like, I think I've heard of this dude in the sky with white robes, but what does that have to do with my life? All I really want is my dad, who isn't there. And so I had this really hard time with God in my life at that time, because for me, since it was my dad trying to teach me about God, I'm like, why would I embrace that? It didn't make any sense to me. And so, he didn't live the life that you would hope a minister would live. Let's put it that way. And so I write a little bit about it in the book. I don't want to trash the memory of him now, because I've healed from a lot of that. But he didn't live that life. And we're going to
get to his story about when you and I first met. But when you were 9, at least for me, because I'm also a child psychiatrist, what I see happening, and maybe it has to do with your mother and the shotgun and the sound of her racking the gun, that you begin to develop a separation anxiety disorder.
It was terrible. So I had it I had it when I was young, but it just peaked when I was 9. I would sneak in the back of her car when she was going to work, and then she'd find out and I would make her late and she would get mad. I was terrified because I was home alone, and she was I was not close to my dad at all. I hated going there for the summers, except my stepmom was okay. But I knew if something happened to my mom, that's where I would have to go. And I was just like not having any of it. So if something happened to her and she would work late at night, my mom drove big rigs. She was a bartender. She had a steam cleaning business, a janitorial business, for big buildings, a commercial. The woman would do anything to survive, but she was never home. She was
entrepreneurial, right, and a very hard worker.
And so when she started bartending, that's when it sort of went sideways, because she, wouldn't get home until, even if normally she wouldn't get home until 3. But then all of a sudden, a couple of nights she didn't show up. And so I went into a full-blown panic. We didn't have cell phones. I went into a full-blown panic attack. I was vomiting and hyperventilating, and it was awful. And I was going through the phone book, calling all the 24-hour restaurants and bars I could find. Initially they paged her, and then it happened again. And I called and they're like, what? No, okay, this is weird. And then by the 3rd time they wouldn't do it anymore. And so they're like, this crazy kid is just like, keeps calling here. And she was like,
are you home alone during those times?
So I don't remember, actually. I think my grandmother was staying with us, but she never came out of her room. And so when I asked my mom, she actually said, no, your grandmother was there, but I never saw my grandmother. She was always, holed up in her room. And it didn't change the fact that it was my mom I was afraid of losing. So my grandmother never really knew what was happening, but she didn't come home. And so, and I would make her promise me, if you're not coming home, she's like, I went out to breakfast with friends. I just needed to unwind. And I'm like, she's like, I'm sorry. I'm like, you need to promise me you're not going to do that again. You have to call me. She's like, I just didn't want to wake you up. I thought you were asleep. I'm like, don't do that again. And then she would do it again. And so I finally just started panicking. But then I started to disconnect. There was a point where.
And you would imagine
her dead. I just began to imagine her dead. And so I'm like, I couldn't take it anymore. And so I started visualizing, if she were dead in the street, she were in a car accident, the police would come to the door. What would they say to me? Just like when my uncle died, I pictured that whole scenario. How would I handle it? Where would I go? What would I do? And pretty soon I began to be able to handle her not being there. Not well, but I mean.
So you can see why you might develop an attachment disorder and why when we fell in love, you didn't trust it.
Oh,
you
absolutely
kept going
not.
away.
I was waiting for the other shoe to fall.
Pushing me away because your primary caretakers, both your mother and your father, taught you that they were unreliable.
Right. Yeah. One because she couldn't help it, and the other one because whatever. You just didn't.
Well, we'll get to him.
Yeah.
We'll get to him. So that's actually how you overcame the separation anxiety disorder, is you disconnected.
And that's my point, that strategies that work for you for survival when you're young, because it kept me safe, it kept me sane when I was young. But they don't work for you when you're 40 and you're trying to fall in love with someone who's really amazing. And you keep thinking the other shoe's going to fall and this guy can't be real. Right. And I'm like, no, stay safe. So same strategies don't work.
And now she tells me that if she's running, it's only because she's chasing.
Till death do us part. Yes. You want to be attached, I'm attached.
If you could go back to that 9-year-old, what would you tell her?
I would hope that I could just tell her it's going to be okay and show her a picture of me now. It's it's going to be okay. This is going to be your life. You're going to have a purposeful life.
And perhaps when the societal unrest started, it triggered her pain.
Oh, not perhaps. There's no perhaps about it.
Because it's triggered so many people. The incidence of depression has tripled since March. So really crazy. All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about stepfathers and more trauma in the relentless courage of a scared child. We have a great event coming December 12th, Overcoming Anxiety, Depression, Trauma, and Grief with Tana, and I'm going to talk, as well as Pastor Derwin Gray. You'll love him, Dr. Carolyn Leaf, Pastor Miles McPherson. We're going to give you very practical strategies, the same ones we teach our patients at Amen Clinics. If you stay to the end, there's going to be a raffle for free evaluation at Amen Clinics. You can also pre-order the book. We'd love if you pre-ordered the book at relentlesscourage.com. Pre-order it on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com, anywhere great books are sold. But relentlesscourage.com, you can enter in your receipt number and download just really some amazing gifts. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking about the relentless courage of a scared child. Also our upcoming event, overcoming anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief. And I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, it took me a while. You kept pushing me to talk about it. What's interesting to me is that now that I started talking about it, it's not as hard, obviously, but the comments I get, this was me growing up. This was my life growing up. Mine was so similar. I can so relate to this. I mean, it's amazing how many people out there, I used to call myself garden variety dysfunctional in our family. And that was a defense mechanism, but it's not that far off. Like, there's a lot of people out there going through,
30 million Americans grew up in an alcoholic home. There's 30 million children.
Well, and it's not just alcoholic homes. It's abandonment and it's...
Or it's untreated ADD.
Right.
I mean, this is really very common. And, neither my mom or dad have ADD. And, I'm so grateful for them. I mean, I was mad at my dad for most of my life because he was gone. And when he was home, he was sort of an ass. But I had, for the most part,
stability,
predictability,
right.
Especially.
I mean, as stable as having 5 sisters can be.
Yeah.
As predictable as having 5 sisters can be. Right.
All right. Now you just traumatized me. And we won't talk about the goat.
See, I actually think it's great that he had 5 sisters because he came housebroken, fully trained. I'm grateful to them.
All right. So let me read one more. From Patricia Steele. Thanks for the podcast. It was helpful for me in understanding behavior of especially children of addictive
what
families.
We're talking about.
Here we go. All right. So chaotic, unpredictable, house getting broken into, nearly drowned, uncle is murdered, panic attacks, an unusual grandmother who's actually diagnosed
Well, and my mother
with
was a little unusual. She had these visions. So that was a little odd to grow up.
We haven't talked about that
yet.
And what was that like when you were a child? Did you understand that?
Well, I mean, I grew up with it. So I don't, when something is introduced to you at such a young age, I don't know if if there's this revelation of like, oh, my mom is psychic. If you ever use the word psychic, she would freak out. She hated that word. She never took money for it. She never used the word psychic, but she'd have these, detailed visions. It was my mom who actually saw the house where my uncle was murdered. And so the house, the street name, the whole thing was really crazy. But that's the kind of stuff I grew up with. And it happened a lot. And people would show up at our house wanting her to read their future. And she's like, no, she wouldn't do it. But stuff would just happen. The visions would just come to her. And so it was really sort of weird. Yeah.
And your mom always liked me. So I think she had that vision that I was not going to hurt you.
Right.
Right.
And so, and actually I've always
trusted
like
some of the people you did.
Right. And I trusted that a little bit. Right. So I actually, because she'd never really been wrong.
So psychic phenomenon is actually pretty interesting when it comes to the brain. I've scanned channelers. I did Teresa Caputo, who's the Long Island medium. And so, I don't know. I just think it's interesting in that if you're a scientist, you shouldn't dismiss it. You should study it.
My mom thinks it's a gift from God. That's how she describes it.
But she had a bad picker when it came to men. And then one of the next major stories in The Relentless Courage of a Scared Child is about your very brief stepfather.
Yeah, they got married really quickly. He convinced her it was good for tax purposes. And he didn't talk to me before they got married. I mean, he did not speak to me before they got married. He barely acknowledged my existence. And then as soon as they were married, my mom always went to bed early. But at that stage, she wasn't working nights because she got up early. And she had a job that started really early in the morning. And so I would be up doing homework. I was, I was really young. I was in middle school. And so I'd get up to go to the kitchen and get something to drink or to eat. And all of a sudden he pulled me in his lap one night and it's kind of an ugly situation. And I write about it in detail in the book, but he pinned me down and he was like trying to kiss my ear. And he's like, when do I get to teach you how to kiss? And I'm like, what? He's like, well, you wouldn't know this because you don't have a dad, but this is what dads do. And then from there, it just got worse. There's this whole scenario that happens where, and I see, it's still hard for me to use the word molested, but I guess that's by definition what happened. He molested me. So, but
yeah, no, initially when we first met, she goes, no, I wasn't molested. I was almost molested. And I'm like, okay, tell me what happened. And she describes it in the book. And I said, and if that happened to Chloe,
I'd rip his beating heart out of his chest and feed it to my dog. In fact, early in when we were first dating, one of the first things I had said to you early when we were dating, because I didn't introduce people to my daughter, but for some reason I felt comfortable with him and I was going to introduce him to my daughter. And I said, you just need to know, if anyone ever touches my daughter, I will kill them in their sleep. If they're lucky, it will be in their sleep. And you were like, and you just looked at me and you go, well, that sounds rational. You're like, but why do you say that?
And I actually met Chloe 6 days after we met.
Yeah.
We went to Disneyland together and she crawled up into my
Which
lap.
was just freaking me out.
So,
but I was ever watchful. I never had a babysitter. I wouldn't leave her alone. Not even with you. I wouldn't leave her alone.
The reason you never had a babysitter is you were abused by your babysitters.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting to the level of denial people can be in about the reality of what actually happened.
Well, and that's because, I mean, now I understand it. I didn't really understand it back then. I would do that same minimizing thing. It's like, well, I wasn't really molested because I know people who like were raped for years and I wasn't that. And so, I mean, that was the one time my mom really validated me. She physically attacked him. I mean, she almost.
Well, it's actually, it's a great story in the book, and you come to really love her mother during.
It was tragic, but I mean, she tried to kill him.
Because when you told her about it, and unfortunately, many people who tell their parents minimize it, or their parents deny it, or their parents say that you're lying, because the parents can't deal with the shame and the anxiety of the truth and having to confront their husband, their brother, whoever.
Yeah, well, she almost killed him. It was really, really dramatic. But she did go through that. She felt, and she ended up seeing a psychiatrist for a long time because she was almost suicidal. Yeah, but she did protect me from that, and it was, it's one of my really.
How do you think that impacted you?
So it impacted me in a way that I felt very validated, and that was really powerful. The only tricky part was shortly after that, I sort of felt like she took my voice away. She asked me to be polite to him, and I lost my mind. There was a weird situation where he called the house, and I was very impolite to him. She asked me to be polite to him, but she actually got mad at me for being so impolite. And I was so angry at her for a long time. I was angry at her for that. I'm like, you want me to be polite to him? I'm supposed to be polite to someone who almost raped me? Like what? And so I felt like for a while, I felt like she had taken my voice away. Now, in hindsight, after writing my story, I realized the reasons, and sometimes those reasons are complicated. But I, at that point, became sort of a very attitudinal teen, let's put it that way, or tween. I became very attitudinal because I made the decision at that point in my life, I'm not going to be timid anymore. No one, not even my mom, is going to take away my voice. So yeah, I used it pretty harshly for a while. It took me a while to temper that voice. But I made that decision, and I'm like, I will be a B word and apologize later if I'm wrong before I will ever let someone take my voice away again. If I think I'm in danger, like, it's on.
Well, and the next guy was Joe.
Yeah.
The next guy,
my next stepfather,
didn't molest you, but
my nickname was Sexy Bitch.
Yeah, but that's abusive. That's abusive how he treated you. Now, people are not black.
He's
and white,
complicated,
right? And that's why, often in the movies,
because he also
it's like you're all
me.
good or you're all bad. You're the antagonist or the protagonist.
No, he was complicated. He wore a black hat and he wore a white hat. Like, he'd switch hats. And so he could say things to me. He never tried to touch me, though. And it was weird. I actually almost hoped he would, because I was trying to get rid of him. And I knew that's the one thing that my mom would kill him for. So I was like, if he touches me, I can get rid of this guy, because I didn't want any men in our house after that. But instead, is like, I can say this to you, but no one else can. And he almost like, he got in physical fights with people for making comments to me. And so
that he would protect you and taught you.
So it was weird. It was a weird dynamic.
Lessons. But I think that's true for all of us, is that we're complicated. And, Carl Jung talked about the shadow self. Some people, the shadow is just living their life, right? The darkness. But most people have dark sides and light sides.
Mm-hmm.
So, the relentless courage of a scared child. We have so much more. I think the eating disorder is coming up, and then the assault.
No, the assault first, yeah.
The assault. Stay with us. So what did you learn? That if your children are telling you someone's molesting them, you need to take that seriously. You need to pay attention.
You need to at least check it out.
Don't take away their voice. You want to be a good listener. It's just absolutely essential. You can pre-order the book, relentlesscourage.com. Don't forget about our event, December 12th, Overcoming Anxiety, Depression, Trauma, and Grief. Stay with us. At Amen Clinics, we're creating a revolution in psychiatry. All other medical specialists look at the organ they treat before they treat it, but most psychiatrists never look and end up guessing based on whatever symptoms you tell them. But how do you know unless you look? Brain SPECT imaging gives us a new way to look at your brain, to understand and treat your symptoms, so you can ultimately know what is going on and feel better. Welcome back. This was actually one of the hardest times that you experienced. So we talked about being molested, and your mom was a hero in that story, where she believed you, she protected you. But then something happened.
Yeah, so I felt very validated. She tried to kill him. It was very dramatic, and that was fairly traumatic all by itself, just the whole drama of the whole situation. But I felt validated. And then, things are complicated, and I've spent years trying to sort of figure it out, and I think I sort of have. But at the time, I didn't understand it. So I was working, and all of a sudden, we owned a pet store at the time. So I was working in the store, and all of a sudden he called, and I hear his voice. I never thought I would have to see him or hear from him again. And I hear his voice on the phone. It was like someone sucker punched me. And so
this is your stepfather who molested you.
Yeah. And so I hear that voice, that just slimy, sweet, icky voice that just, triggered me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't timid. I was always a timid kid. I had learned to hide. I had learned to be quiet. I had learned to sort of stay out of the way, fly under the radar. And for the first time, I felt angry. And so I was really angry, and I just sort of lost it. And so I yelled some words I shouldn't have yelled. And well, maybe I should have. Actually, I don't think I shouldn't have. Let me take that back. I yelled some words that I'm not going to repeat. Let me put it that way. And so I took the phone, and there was this metal sort of cage sitting next to me, and I slammed the phone down on the cage intentionally to hurt his ears, if you will. And so I yelled for my mom to come, and she came, and she got mad at me. And so she comes over, and she's mad at me, and she's like, be polite. And I'm like, I'm not going to be polite to him. He tried to rape me. And she's like, Tana, be polite. Now, there were a lot of reasons that she said that I didn't understand at the time. All I heard and all I felt was her taking my voice away, in a situation where I was the victim. And I felt like that was just so wrong. And I was so angry at her. And even though we were really close, my mom and I were really close when I was growing up, but that sort of left this seed of, resentment that festered for a while. It took me a while to sort of figure that out. And I made this decision on my own that I would never let anyone take my voice again. I was not timid after that. So I went a little extreme.
Anybody here would think you're timid.
No. And I went a little extreme the other direction, right? It took me a while to find balance, because when I went from the extreme of being timid to finding my voice and not really having guidance with it and not feeling supported in it, that caused me to lash out a lot. So I sounded like this very angry teenager for a while, and I was, but I could really hurt people. My tongue was very caustic, let's put it that way. And it took me a while to learn the power of my voice, that it has the power to heal and it has the power to hurt. And that took maturity and a lot of work, because for a while I didn't have that. I was just like, I will literally cut you down. So if you get in the way or you try to hurt me. And, so now with maturity, I've learned how to handle it differently. But I can go to the dark side if someone is threatening me or my family.
Really?
Yeah, a little bit. And so, but I've taught my daughter something. I would rather my daughter err.
I have examples.
I would rather my daughter err on the side of saying something inappropriate when she's in fear, and not being polite, and then apologizing later if she's wrong, than being this sweet, polite little girl and getting hurt. I will never go along with that. It's not okay with me. So I did not raise a wallflower.
No, you didn't. So what can people do? Because I think people probably relating to your story about when they lost their voice, or they found it and they don't have control over it. What are some of the helpful things you found? So,
for a while I'd hear I'd hear these phrases like, oh, she's a bitch, or she's a scary bitch. And that was what I would hear a lot. And that's, I was okay with that at the time.
We would actually say things like,
thank you.
You say like,
it's a bad thing.
Like it's a bad
thing.
Thank
you. Because to me, that felt like it had to be either or. Either I was a bitch or I was like sweet and polite. And what I came to learn is that it's not either or. Maybe I'm not a bitch. Maybe what I am is protecting. It's a protective reflex that I just had to learn how to manage. And, there's so many people who can help you learn communication, and even therapy, just working through the trauma can help you let go of the anger, which can then help you to just manage how you talk to people. But it's not that I have a problem being that when I have to be that, but it's not either or. Your voice does have the power to heal. It does have the power to hurt, and you have a responsibility with it. And
so whenever I teach assertiveness, because that's really what you're talking about, when you think of voice, it's assertiveness, is I always think of the words firm.
Yes.
You have to say what you mean.
Right.
And kind.
Yeah.
Which is try to do it with a purpose to get what you want without diminishing the other person. Unless you mean to, like in this situation.
I meant to.
You meant to.
I meant to.
Because
and I felt like
it was a reaction to his bad behavior.
And make no mistake, I have no need to try to be kind to any pedophile. So I still would not be. Let's just be
clear. No, when we met, you're like, was one of the first things you said, anyone that touches
me?
No,
we were on a date, and I told you, it sort of came up somewhat randomly, but I said, oh no, you wanted to meet Chloe. And I said, well, there's one thing you should know. I didn't really let her meet people when I was dating. So I was going to let her meet you. And I said, there's something you should know. If anyone ever touches my daughter, I will kill them in their sleep. That's if they're lucky. Alive and slowly if they're not. Like, I was very clear. And you just looked at me and you're like, well, that sounds rational. And I was like, what? Like, well, that didn't work.
And I was thinking to myself, I wonder what that's connected to.
Of course you were, because you're a psychiatrist.
Well, we want you to find your voice. And one way to do it is read The Relentless Courage of a Scared Child and see how you can relate to the 30 million people in the United States that grew up in an alcohol alcoholic home. I mean, it's very common. There's over 20 million people that would meet the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, when you first told me that, I was like, that's ridiculous. But I think that's a reflex that a lot of us use.
Well, you protect yourself
right.
by basically saying, I wasn't molested.
I couldn't say the word.
Yeah. And then I asked her, I said, well, if someone did to Chloe what your stepfather did to you,
I would rip his beating heart out of his chest and feed it to my dog.
There you have it. Relentlesscourage.com is where you can pre-order the book or come to our event, free, virtual, December 12th. You can sign up for it at tanaamen.com/event. Stay with us.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're considering coming to Amen Clinics or trying some of the brain healthy supplements from BrainMD, you can use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or a 10% discount on all supplements at brainmdhealth.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.